Thank you, Lauren, so much. I'm going to trust that everyone can see this PowerPoint, and if not, then I will also trust that you will raise wild provocations to remind me to fix that. So thank you, Lauren, again, for agreeing to graciously moderate this panel. I think, or I hope at least, that you'll have some thoughts to my paper, and I'm really happy to follow up on Anne's paper as well, since Anne gave us such a wide variety of images to think with. I really want to concentrate on one image, so hopefully it will provide a nice contrast and pairing here in this panel. So originally I had written an entirely different introduction to the paper. It had a lot to do with Hannah Arendt. I was concentrating on the movement from work to action and thinking about the Fabri-Tignari relief in that way. And I still think that's important. But after a couple of days of listening to and grappling with what have been really excellent and thought-provoking papers, I thought I would reframe it a little bit, because we've talked a lot about the public negotiation of status for professionals, the role of collegia or other professional associations in providing or denying connectivity to skilled workers, the training of skilled laborers and its implication in the hierarchies of power inherent in enslavement, the oscillation between identification with work as an individual versus as a corporate group, and what differences those two types of identification might have, the developing ritual realities and mechanisms of death, which I'll touch upon a little bit here as well, the figuring of activities as either work, denied subjectivity, or as action, and again, Arendtian terms. So all of these figure in one way or another into the subject of my talk today, which takes as its principal subject this relief that you see in the background of the screen here, the Fabri-Tignari relief. This paper was, after all, written in response to the workshops this past year, in which many of the other speakers participated and shared their work exploring our theme of work life. And I hope that this very nascent form of my paper will be of some interest to each of you in the conference. And I hope that you have thoughts about developing the ideas presented here further, because this is really just a first foray. So in particular, I want to use the relief as a case study to reconstruct the process of status and identity negotiation. And I really want to concentrate on that idea of it being a negotiation and not simply a statement, or described especially by Jane in her paper on merchant stereotyping, and alluded to also to some extent by Rebecca in her paper. So the so-called Fabri-Tignari relief, which is currently housed in Rome's Centrale Monte Martini, is only one example of how claims concerning both status and identity could and were made in the Roman world, and will serve as the principal subject, as I was saying, of my presentation. The relief, quite surprisingly, given its quality, has been the subject of remarkably little focused analysis, as it appears only infrequently as a comparandum for other iconographic representations of workshop or labor scenes outside of its initial publication by Antonio Maria Collini in 1947. So today I want to explore how this monument can contribute to our understanding of how occupational status was negotiated publicly in first century CE Rome. And after introducing the monument, the artifact itself, I will first treat the stylistics and contents of the scene, situating it within the aesthetic history of public-facing religious art in Rome. And what I want to suggest in that little section is that the Fabri-Tignari relief can be understood as a bridge between private funerary art and public monumental religious art, connecting traditions of iconographic representation across what, at first blush, might be conceived of as entirely different spheres of symbolic communication. And in the second section, I will shift to a consideration of the social and religious context of the relief in an attempt to reconstruct the ritual moments in which those interacting with the monument might have confronted and interpreted its figural reliefs. I want to emphasize here that the reconstruction I'll offer is merely an attempt, and that's one attempt, at reconstructing this world of possibilities available for viewing. Is merely one attempt among many moments in which one could imagine people interacting with and activating these images, but I think it's a particularly powerful one. So in doing this, I think it will allow us to better grasp the claims being made by the relief and its patrons. And ultimately, I'll argue that beyond simply being a representative example of how occupational status could be negotiated in the Roman world, the relief is a testament to the ability of one occupation in particular, that of the Fabri-Tignari, to transform the essence of their work, eliding its obvious economic value in favor of making their work an integral part of the proper worship of the gods, and incidentally, the proper functioning of the state. So in 1938, a group of 6 marble architectural blocks were uncovered by the team of Antonio Maria Collini during the excavation of the Piazza Montanara to make way for the new Via del Mare, today the Via del Teatro di Marcello. 2 of these blocks preserve figural relief. You can see those at the lower left. Of the 2, the smaller is heavily damaged. Its iconographic images basically impossible to discern. We can see that there are some figures, but that's about it. The larger, aside from some damage to the deepest parts of the relief, remains reasonably well preserved for such a deeply cut relief, as you can see in this top right image. In his 1947 publication of the blocks, Collini hypothesized that given their proximity to one another in excavation and their corresponding dimensions, the cornice blocks all belong to the same monument, and Collini's reconstruction is on the upper left here. In his estimation, this monument was a square altar of approximately 3.8 meters on each side. The appearance of a figure of Minerva at far left on the relief suggested to Collini that the altar was therefore dedicated to the goddess, most likely by the Collegium of the Fabbri Tignarii, whose scola, or whose Collegium center, historians presume was located in the nearby Forum Boarium, the location being hypothesized based principally on the density of inscriptions and dedications related to the Collegium found in that area. And that includes a fragmentary inscription that could be interpreted as referring to the skull of the Fabbri itself. And this is to the right on the bottom part of your screen. Although its restoration is not without dispute, as you can imagine, it is heavily reconstructed. Collini's original conclusions of 1947 remain, I think, largely acceptable, and everyone does accept them, in fact. It hasn't really been disputed. And they still appear to be sound, even if some particulars remain tentative, and I'm also tentative about some of these particulars. To be sure, the size of the blocks, as Collini remarks, would have allowed for a remarkably large altar structure, especially for a private corporation, placing the fragmentary relief block on a par with the cornice blocks of the podium of the Temple of Portunus in the Forum Boarium at left, and the cornice blocks of the bases of the monumental columns of Trajan and Antonius Pius, the middle and right here on the left-hand picture. This dwarfs the size of numerous other examples of Augustan-era altars dedicated to the Lares Augusti by neighborhood magistrates throughout the city of Rome, as well as other altars dedicated by the Fabbri in the 1st century BCE in both Rome and Ostia, ultimately making the hypothesized altar one of the largest of which we are aware existed in Rome that wasn't a state-affiliated one. So just for an example, an illustrative comparison, the actual altar structure within Augustus's Arapakis enclosure measures approximately 3 by 5 meters. So a 3.8 meter square altar in the Forum Boarium area would have been quite conspicuous, I think, especially given the older and smaller monumental structures on average that are typically found in that area. To be sure, Collini's assumption that the 6 cornice fragments belong to the same structure, while much more likely than not, could very well be incorrect, although his reconstruction looks quite good without actually having seen all 6 blocks in person myself. Not to mention the possibility that the structure was not, in fact, an altar, but plausibly a statue base. And I'm thinking here of the still disputed so-called altar of Domitius Ahenobarbus that Anne has talked about, some believing that it's a statue base for an imperator, others that it is, in fact, an altar. So this isn't all 100% sure. But still, I think the preponderance of the evidence suggests that unless some other data emerge, our structure can be safely interpreted as a monumental altar or as a statue base in conversation with an altar. And this is going to be important because we'll see another altar that actually demonstrates a cult image of Minerva and an altar in front of it. So the content of the relief appears at first glance relatively straightforward, and this is probably why it hasn't been commented on very much, even given the damage to its figures, with workers engaged in various stages of craft activity, punctuated by the tools of the Fabbri hung on the wall. At left, the figure of Minerva appears in front of one workman in a somewhat Phidian pose, shield propped against her left leg, her left arm outstretched, perhaps gesturing, as in this gold glass medallion in the Vatican, much later, 3rd century, or propped up on her spear, her right arm held down slightly away from her body, perhaps holding an object, although her arms are no longer with us. And you can see here this, this image of Minerva on the gold The gold medallion here reversed, but in a very similar pose. The goddess stands about half a head taller than other figures in the relief, including the workman to her right, whose height is raised by a dais, suggesting again that it is actually an epiphany of the goddess. To the right, our right, in the relief is a workman, another one, mallet at foot, tunic draped over one shoulder, standing over either a sawhorse or, as some have argued, a lathe. This is questionable. The next scene, punctuated at left by a hanging Norma and at right by calipers, contains two workers engaged with the same job. Their girded waists and stooped bodies could indicate that they are lifting an object now lost to damage. Moving to the next scene, another worker applies finishing touches to an ornate table. He too in a dropped shoulder tunic, while a second laborer, heavily damaged, sits. What his work consists of is too difficult to tell. And finally, separated by a hanging bracket saw, one final figure faces right, likely in visual conversation with another figure on the next, missing cornice block, and holding a circular object, likely a wooden tabletop. The Fabri-Tignari frieze draws from two distinct and seemingly contradictory stylistic traditions of figural stone relief. The most obvious is that of occupational funerary reliefs, evidenced in abundance at Ostia, but found throughout the cities of the Roman Mediterranean, that declare the artisanal affiliations of the deceased through an iconographic reproduction of tools, of working scenes, or both. So numerous are these examples by the end of the 1st century, ranging from the activity of a bustling butcher's block in Ostia to the simple if proud display of one's tools of the trade, as in the Caponianus relief in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, shown large at the center of the slide, that their sheer ubiquity has prompted art historians to reconsider whether attitudes towards work and labor had experienced something of a shift. And to be sure, in combination with Sandra Joshel's study of Rome's occupational inscriptions and Paul Vane's exploration of the plebs media of the Roman Empire, also largely through epigraphic evidence, it would be tempting to see in this shift in the commemoration of the dead the crystallization of a shared identity, lauding the harsh realities of a laboring life. From childhood, work was always by my side, reads one epitaph from Verona. Another from the Alpine city of Aosta proclaims, while I lived, I strove for more, never did I stop experiencing loss. Now, some funerary reliefs go further than others in visualizing the labor durus with which the deceased identified. The altar of Lucius Cornelius Atomatus is one such example. It's been much talked about, approaching the stylistic refinement of the Fabri-Tignari relief and echoing many of its elements, in fact, including a scene of labor in medias res, as well as the depiction of the products that such work yielded. Again, Ostia's Isola Sacra necropolis hosts dozens of such reliefs, many in terracotta, suggesting the broad range of cost that the production of such monuments could entail. In Tomb 29, for example, we see another dual scene displaying the production and sale of knives and other tools, much like the altar of Atomatus. So what are we to make of such reliefs? There appears at first little analytical heft to simply claiming that such commemorations made in the funerary sphere signaled the identification of workers with their labor, its tools, and its products. Complex questions of subjectivity and identity, who can claim it, how it is produced, how it is communicated, are seemingly reduced to a checklist. A regula and norma on my grave altar is sufficient. On my reading, this isn't far from the typical conclusions drawn from these monuments, namely that they are an interesting, if relatively simple, insight into the world of the lower or professional classes. What these interpretations seem to overlook, however, is the rich tradition of what Anne has actually elsewhere called Roman thing art, which takes as its subject the display of ritual implements and religious tools in reverent array on as varied media as funeral altars such as these and public monumental architecture. The presence of patera, litus, jug, Ukrainia, implements of sacrifice, garlands, and religious relics on both funerary and neighborhood altars draws directly upon the iconographic language of sacred public art, in which the thing takes upon a subjectivity of its own as both tool and agent, declaring a sacrificial act both completed and aspirational. Successive generations of viewers, as Gosden has brilliantly noted, enter a world already filled with objects and things whose intentions are given and assumed and even communicated by those things to the viewer on reliefs such as this, the viewer who becomes a participant in the ongoing process signaled by those very things. For funerary altars in particular, the identity of the deceased in some ways depends upon these ritual things. The presence of these tools in a group communicating, as Laetitia Lafollette has hypothesized, proper ritual affordances to both the viewer and the interred. In the notable instances in which such implements appear in public architecture, for example, in the frieze of the Portico of Octavia or that of the Temple of Vespasian, the proper performance of ritual is communicated through the ordering of these religious things in abstract space, calling to mind the verbal formulae uttered by Rome's priests during sacrificial rites. And I'm actually reminded slightly of John's Nenia and thinking about the formulaic nature of that and its communicative potential. An altar dedicated to Minerva by the ministry of the second lustrum of the Fabri Tignarii, once again, which would place the date sometime between 2 BCE and 3 CE, if we understand Augustus's reorganization of collegia in 7 BCE to mark the first lustrum, is here quite crucial, I think. Those interested in the monument have concentrated mostly on the two sides depicting a sacrifice at a statue of Minerva and the commemoration of a processional statuette of the goddess, both of which afford scholars important information regarding ritual commemoration undertaken by corporate groups. The other sides of the monument, however, are just as, if not more revealing, even if typically overlooked. On one of its sides appear the ritual implements of the sacrifice, litus, apex, and culter, overlapping a garland and overhanging the tools of the Faber Tignarius, the bracket saw, bow saw, the pickaxe, the axe, and strangely, helmets. While we might be tempted to simply read the presence of the secular things of the Faber as a declaration of identity, their inclusion with the implements of ritual communicates a religious significance, I believe, as well. Visually, the placement of litus, apex, and culter could indicate the primacy of the proper performance of sacrifice and the secondary importance of working tools. Alternatively, the tools themselves could be understood as the foundation upon which the performance of sacrifice is possible. And in any case, the erasure of any distinction between religious and secular things on this panel is clear and evident as the objects declare their use in a decidedly religious setting. And I think here we also have to think about votive art and the act of dedication of votives, which we have examples for tools and for miniatures of tools in various locations in the Roman West. The monumental and public nature of our Fabri Tignarii relief would suggest that a similar reading of its tools could be profitably adopted, that their display, especially in the context of Minerva's Epiphany, are in fact signaling their fundamental role in her worship. The viewer is invited to wield the tools under the tutelage of the goddess, the act of making transformed into an act of worship. And I'll argue this point further in the next section when I'm thinking about the social and religious context of the relief. But for now, our previous discussion of public architecture leads us naturally to considering how the Fabri relief shared in the communicative visual vocabulary of other public monuments in its period. So the spacing and corporeality of the figures in the Fabri relief is immediately evocative of that of the frieze relief on the Arch of Titus, with its processional figures isolated deeply. So on the one hand, such space and depth gives the viewer of the arch from ground level the advantage of being capable of discerning both the visual language of the scene of procession and therefore its ritual significance, with its static figures frozen in austere reverence to Roman tradition. On the other hand, it recalls similar depictions of processions much closer to eye level, including the processions represented on the inner altar of the Areopagus. It's tempting to interpret the workshop scene of the Fabri Tignarii relief similarly as a procession of sorts, demonstrating the worship of Minerva in process through craft activities and their products. And there's something too of an aspirational quality to all of these scenes, which reproduce the moments just before the deity has been properly propitiated, before the sacrifice of the ox, before the pouring of the libation, before the completion of a table. Now, to what extent these resonances would allow us to consider the Fabri relief within the category that these processional reliefs are usually included, and sometimes called historical reliefs, is an interesting problem, I think, that I'm not going to be able to treat here, but I think is probably worth revisiting. Anne has already talked about this relief in the Forum Transitorium, and Marco will talk about this relief a little bit further, but in Ovid's representation of the myth. But this is the clearest comparandum that we do possess because, again, it's a depiction of Minerva in the public sphere. The central scene of of the form transitorium relief shows Minerva looming aggressively over the figure of Arachne, who shrinks back, falling to one knee as she raises a hand in evident fear. Minerva herself, here, raises one hand, though with the intent to devastate rather than deflect. Flanking the scene of divine punishment are a number of women engaged in various stages of woolworking and textile manufacture. The parallels to the Fabry relief are more, in fact, due to content, however, than style, showing individuals in the midst of their labor. The reliefs demonstrate a mastery of the worker, of the actual carver of the relief, over the representation of drapery, appropriate for its theme, that far surpasses the heavily weighted and flat fabrics of the Fabri Tignari relief, aside from the clear care taken on the folds of Minerva's drapery. This latter point again suggests that Minerva's presence in our relief is epiphanic, perhaps, entering into the scene as if from the form transitorium itself, though here her affect is of a patroness rather than punisher. It is also tempting to see in the form transitorium release a direct temporal connection to the Fabri Tignari frieze, especially given the apparent monumentality of both. Domitian, who erected the Arch of Titus and broke ground on the form transitorium, held a particular affinity for Minerva since the goddess was an eminently suitable representation of the religious and moral values the emperor wished to convey in his public image. We'll return to that shortly. But for now, I want to turn to a consideration of the social and religious context of the relief, and to offer some speculation as to how those interacting with these images may have viewed them. So it's important to remember that such altars as that to which the Fabri Tignari relief belongs were objects designed to be used and interacted with at certain times within the Roman calendar. The most likely time at which our altar would have been used was the Quinquatria, festival dedicated to Minerva in her capacity as patron of crafts and celebrated from the 19th to the 23rd of March. In his Fasti, Ovid describes the festivities and their associated rites. And I'll refrain from reading all of this out for you, but you can read through it as I'm speaking here. While the historical origins of the Quinquatria remain a matter of contentious debate among scholars of Roman religion, by the 1st century BCE, it's quite clear that the festival was recognized as being dedicated solely to Minerva. Our earliest extant calendar, the Fastientiedes Maiores from the 1st century BCE, lists the Quinquatria Minervae on March 19th as a public holiday. So too, the Fasti Praenestini lists the festival on March 19th, with a comment from the grammarian Varius Flaccus that the festival was sacred for artisans. And you can see that on the right. What's preserved for the Fasti Praenestini is just a commentary that mentions that the fact that it's a sacred festival for artisans. The Emperor Domitian himself, the original patron of the Forum Transitorium, the Temple of Minerva within that precinct, and the relief of the Arachne myth already discussed, was so taken with the festival that, Suetonius remarks, he celebrated it privately at his Alban estate and established a new priestly college to perform her rites and to oversee annual games held in her honor at Rome. Peter Heinrich von Blankenhagen has even suggested that the Forum Transitorium precinct was designed to host the private rites of the Quinquatria celebrated by collegia, though the nature of the festival is sacra publica, in which Rome's pontifices were required to take part, would caution against that reading. Although the festival of the Quinquatria was officially celebrated through public rites, we should expect that the various collegia of Rome also held their own celebrations and made dedications in honor of their patron goddess. And here a painting from the Via del Abbondanza in Pompeii, discussed by John Clark in his book Art and the Lives of Ordinary Romans, demonstrates what such worship might entail. The painting shows 4 men carrying a ferculum, complete with a gabled roof, garlands, and several figures engaging in the work of carpentry. Such litters as depicted here were a typical part of religious processions, as images of the gods sculpted in wood would be carried through the streets en route to the appropriate altar or temple. And Brian Madigan's book has a great chapter on these fercula. Depicted at right, as John Clark has argued, is the legendary figure of Daedalus, the master carpenter, looming over his nephew and assistant, Perdix, murdered out of jealousy. At far left are the remains of a depiction of Minerva in her familiar pose. You can just see her here, shield at her side, arm outstretched. Between these 2 larger figures are 3 smaller ones engaged in the work of carpentry. The juxtaposition of scenes of mundane labor with both an epiphany of Minerva and a representation of Daedalus's murderous jealousy is at first glance perhaps strange. But as John Clark has suggested, the message transmitted by Daedalus reinforces the one implicitly communicated by the presence of Minerva. who similarly would not hesitate to exact her revenge upon skilled workers who did not propitiate her properly, as we have seen in the Forum Transitorium reliefs. Like the image of Daedalus in the Carpenter's Procession painting, one could imagine other craft heroes playing similar roles in other collegia. Ovid himself, in that passage from the Fasti, suggests that Tychius, the Homeric inventor of shoemaking, or Epeius, who crafted the Trojan horse, might be the objects of similar veneration by cobblers or carpenters. The curious establishment sometime during the empire of a festival for the legendary metalsmith Mamurius Veturius in mid-March provides another tantalizing connection to such hero worship among Rome's tradespeople. In any case, the images of Arachne's doom in the Forum Transitorium demonstrate the outcome of those refusing to honor the goddess who has bequeathed the gifts of their skills upon them. In this context, the Fabri Tignarii relief can be interpreted, on the one hand, as a devout expression of thanks for bestowing upon the Fabri the skills required to craft objects pleasing to Minerva. Unlike Arachne, the nameless workers of the relief labor solemnly, their work a direct representation of their faith. As the final destination of a procession and the focus of the final moments of dedication, the altar itself reminds those undertaking sacrifice, the magistri quinquennales elected every 5 years, to maintain their piety and their humility, even in the face of immense success and even public acknowledgement. This expression of proper ritual observance through an equation of laboring with worship raises an interesting question about the status of this type of work in the eyes of the public. One byproduct of the Fabri Tignarii's relief equation of labor and religio is the elision of the elements of work that Cicero, in his De Officiis, had described as lending to certain professions an innate filthiness. All artisans are engaged in vulgar crafts, Cicero states, for a workshop is incapable of having anything noble about it. The abundantly clear statement of the Fabri Tignarii relief, however, contends that it is the very nature of their officina that is of a fundamental importance to the worship of Minerva. Without the officina, without the artisans, there cannot be benefactions. Rather than being sordida, the rhetoric of the relief, in combination with the ritual actions taken as part of the celebration of Minerva, as might happen at the festival of the Quinquatria, communicates the same pietas that we have come to expect on public monuments. One must also remember, too, that such public displays of sacrifice were just that, to be viewed and consumed by a public intent on ordering their world through religious epistemologies. The spectacle of the procession, of the objects in tow, the sacrifice, all serve to reinforce the web of relationships binding together their community and highlighting the work, both religious and physical, performed to maintain that community. And I'm reminded again of Daniel's recent book, in which he explores the importance of these public rituals in both everyday life in Rome, but also the punctuated moments of festival that bring people into Rome. Such a desire to assert the participation of the Fabri in public life and in maintaining the welfare of the res publica is strengthened by the relative positions of some of the magistri quinquennales outside of their collegium. 5 liberti of the Augustan household are listed in the Sanctae Prassidae Fasti fragments, fragments recording the quinquennial magistrates of the Fabri Tignarii. 3 were formerly of the imperial household of Claudius, Telon, Tiberius Clodius Onesimus, and Tiberius Claudius, and 2 others, Titus Flavius and Titus Flavius Penn, from the Flavian household. We in fact know something more of one of these figures, Tiberius Claudius Onesimus, who was Magister Quinquennalis in the 18th lustrum of the Collegium from years 83 to 88 CE, during the reign of Domitian. In another inscription, he is listed as being a Redemptor Operum Caesar, suggesting that, as Peter Brunt has detailed for Public Works Administration during the Principate, the magistrates of the Fabri Tignarii relief were responsible for securing and overseeing major public building contracts, and Janet Delane's work on the Fabri Tignarii of Ostia also demonstrates this fact quite well. So it's enticing to wonder whether this Tiberius Claudius Onesimus and some of the other Flavian freedmen of the following lustrum, perhaps from 88 to 93, personally contracted work on the Forum Transitorium, which was began during that time period, a major and surely lucrative project. But of course, this is only speculation and can't be substantiated. But one wonders whether these high-level magistrates in the collegia of the Collegium of the Fabri Tignarii, or even in other collegia, are even Faber Tignarius at all. And we can't get into it too much because I only have so much time, and I'd like to conclude the paper, but there are a number of questions that I'm still thinking about here. One of them being whether some of these individuals at the very highest echelons of the collegium are in fact carpenters in the first instance, or if they really are just political officials used for their network, and in this case, perhaps for Tiberius Claudius Onesimus, used for his connections to the imperial household. I also have questions about individual Faber Tignarius versus the corporate Fabri Tignarii. When one decides to identify as the Faber Tignarius versus as identifying as part of a corporation. I haven't even touched upon the question of freedman art, and this is something that Lauren probably has a lot to add here to the paper, and Eurysthenes himself being a redemptor and identifying as such, similar to Tiberius Claudius Onesimus, where he fits into this picture as well. But in closing, I would like to gesture towards the initial seed of the conference, which was planted nearly half a decade ago, namely that the strange world of our own work life as members of the Academy might be profitably interpreted through the lens of Roman conceptions of work life. What might the case of the Fabri Tignarii reveal about our own struggle with defining our work? For one, it seems to me that the nature of the public negotiation of occupational status and the claims made about that occupation's fundamental importance to the social welfare appear remarkably familiar to many of us who have been required to justify the existence and benefit of humanities departments within the modern Western research university, or even society at large, really, which increasingly treats a college education as a monetary investment, one that must make a profit on its return. And secondly, perhaps, and this is more implicit, the apparent success of the Fabri Tignarii, as well as many other professional associations, represents a case, I think, of inherent tension. On the one hand, their occupation was clearly accorded some measure of respect within the broader society, given their success and their wealth within the, at least as we can tell from their reliefs and their dedications. On the other hand, to achieve this status, they assimilated and reproduced the same tactics and strategies of epistemological segregation against which they simultaneously struggled in the first instance. So you have to remember the members of the Collegium of the Fabri Tignarii were mostly freed people or descendants of freed people. And these tactics and strategies included the very organizational structure with individuals separated into decurii and then magistrates of various sorts presiding over them. And one thing of the systemic injustices that we confront in our own work lives and the systems that we work within, the inconsistencies of those systems, their inequities, the immoralities in some instances, and the inertia felt to eventually participate in those very immoral, inconsistent, and inequitable things as we work ourselves to secure our own lives through our work. And I think this is something that we had talked about in the workshop in particular, is the desire to put aside the sense of urgency that's felt when at the lower levels, when it becomes very clear the subjection and the precariousness. So I'll end there, and I will open the floor to questions. And I hope that we have a nice discussion. I'm really excited to hear from you all about different ways to take this forward. Thank you.